Well, good afternoon, Doug. I'm really delighted we have this chance to talk today. Why don't we begin this podcast by you telling us a bit about your professional background and also about VRE, Virginia Railway Express.
Okay. Well, I started my career in Texas. I worked for a regional planning association in the Dallas-Fort Worth area called the North Central Texas Council of Governments, where I got involved in a lot of regional planning, primarily on transit. One of the things I worked on was the early plans of what became DART, Dallas Area Rapid Transit. So I had an opportunity to go there. And I was there for about 25 years and helped develop plans and then helped develop the projects that were on the plans. And great experience for that organization. And then opportunity presented itself in Austin, and so I went down to Capital Metro in Austin and helped put together plans and also helped implement their first rail line, the commuter rail system that is in operation down in Austin. And so while I was both at Capital Metro and at DART, I had a chance to work on their commuter rail system that in the DART area, the Dallas-Fort Worth area, is the Trinity Railway Express. And so when this opportunity presented itself in Virginia for the Virginia Railway Express, I said that's what it sounds like I want to do, and so I was fortunate to get the job, and so I've been here in Virginia for about 6 years.
Now, we've talked about the fact that VRE has a pretty complex governance structure and that it's kind of a challenge in terms of stakeholder management. Why don't you tell us a bit about that structure? What are the key components of it?
Well, sure. Well, all commuter rail systems are I shouldn't say it that way. Commuter rail systems are pretty unique in that they're all kind of structured a little bit differently. And part of the reason for that is they're really large geographically. They span pretty large distances, and usually they kind of go beyond the stretch of the particular entity that's trying to create it, whether it's a transit system or a county or a couple counties. So we weren't any different when back in the mid 80s there was interest expressed for creating a commuter railroad for Northern Virginia into Washington, D.C. And at the time there was the railroads that were in operation weren't doing very well, and that the deregulation hadn't happened, and so that was pretty much typical around the country. And so there was a lot of interest in that time period of starting commuter railroads across the country. And so in Virginia, they began that process with an organization called the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission, which covers the northern suburbs that are essentially adjacent to Washington, D.C. on the Virginia side. And the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission that began the discussions had been created several decades earlier than that to provide the mechanism by which Virginia would participate in WMATA. And so in that context, they began discussing, well, let's see if we can begin a commuter railroad, and so they organized to have one group start talking to the railroads to get access, and then another group talking to the local elected officials and local neighborhoods about getting support, and then they began the process of creating Virginia Railway Express. It involved actually creating a companion organization that would cover the area south of the NVTC area. And so to allow that part of Virginia to participate, they created a second commission, and that one is called the Potomac and Rappahannock Transportation Commission. So VRE is owned by two different transportation commissions, and I actually work for both of the commissions. I'm an employee of both commissions with the job of managing and running and developing more service on their commuter railroad. It gets a lot more complex than that, but that's the basic structure. There is
so you have two commissions,
mm-hmm.
And how does your board, I assume you have a board that relates to...
Well, we do. So the two commissions developed a master agreement, and it essentially is the Constitution for us, for our purposes. Kind of defines all of the different approvals that are necessary. It defines who's responsible for the stations, parking. All of that is embedded in this pretty detailed document that was really well done. Has been modified over the years, but not a lot. And so it created what's called the Vre Operations Board. And so the Operations Board is comprised of members from the two commissions meeting as a separate board or somewhat like a committee of the two commissions. And so they're the group that gets down into a lot of the details that typical boards would get into. And per the bylaws, or per the master agreement essentially, different types of approvals rise to the level of needing approval also of the two commissions. Or said another way, certain decisions are delegated to the operations board for them to make those decisions, but if it's not delegated, then it gets recommended to the two commissions.
Give us an example of the kinds of decisions your board would make, and then what might be moved up to the commissions, just so we're tracking with you here.
Primarily, approvals of the budgets are, and that's a whole other complex process of not only working within the operations board considerations, but also with the 9-member jurisdictions that get the service. And so as we work out the budget, there's various layers of approval, but from the operations board standpoint, they develop it and then recommend it to the commissions for their approval. So the budgets are adopted by the commissions. But other decisions, such as fare increases, don't rise to the level of going to the commissions, and so the board makes those decisions on fare. So to operate the service, as you would expect, there's quite a few different contracts that we have to enter into, and so if the funding for a contract is within the budget, and we bring forward that contract for the operations board consideration, their approval is all we need to get that contract approved and then continue on. Other more important decisions, such as adopting the budget, rise to the level of getting the operations board to recommend to each commission that they approve that particular action item. So during the course of a month, we've got an operations board meeting and then 2 commission meetings. Fortunately, the 2 commission meetings are on the same night, so I go to the Potomac Rappahannock Transportation Commission early, get the action items done that we need there, and then drive 30 miles down up to Arlington to go to the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission and present again to that commission. So it's a very regional approach. Gets a lot of buy-in from across the region, and I must say it's working very well. Again, all the board members are elected officials from the member jurisdictions, the jurisdictions that we serve, plus a representative from the Commonwealth of Virginia. So the state has a representative on that operations board as well.
Now, before I ask you a bit more about this structure, what is your ridership and what's your annual budget?
Our annual budget is around $130 million a year. We carry right at 20,000 riders a day. We operate Monday through Friday. We don't operate on the weekends. We're very much focused on the commuter railroad, or the commuter traffic from the outer suburbs of Northern Virginia into the employment centers in Northern Virginia and, of course, into Washington, D.C.
Okay. Well, you've described what would have to be called a pretty complex governance structure. You've got the two commissions, you've got an operations board, several decisions made by the operations board routinely, but also decisions that have to be moved to the two commissions.
Mm-hmm.
I assume you wear what I call the Chief Stakeholder Relations Officer hat with real gusto, keeps you hopping. What strategies do you employ to keep your relationship really healthy and solid with these entities? You've got the operations board, the two commissions. Talk a bit about how you manage these relationships.
Sure. Well, in a way, it's somewhat simplified by the fact that my role, my job is to be the CEO for the Virginia Railway Express, and all of the entities that I'm working with are all, also stakeholders and owners of the Virginia Railway Express. So it's all about advancing what's in the best interest of their railroad, and to get to the point of, okay, what is the best interest of the railroad? We use those stakeholders, primarily our operations board, to advance policies or advance projects, obviously to develop a budget, develop capital plans, develop new service improvements, deal with different contractors. And so it's all about how do we get consensus on what's the best approach on all of those subjects, and obviously the individual items relative to each one of those. And so approaching it from what's in the best interest of the VRE, and then relative to whether it's a commission or whether it's an individual jurisdiction, it's a matter of developing consensus, and that really is where we focus most of our attention at the operations board level, because around that table are representatives, elected officials from each of those 9 jurisdictions that get service, plus the state, who has very much an interest in VRE doing well, but also they're a funder of VRE and they want to see us do well. So as different items come up, it requires different levels of discussion, introduction of an issue. Some of them are pretty straightforward. We have a cleaning contract that went through the procurement process. We're recommending this for move approval. Now, they also, over the years, want to dig into what's the procurement process. When do you go for a bid? When do you go for a competitive procurement? And over the years, you build consensus on a process. They dig into an issue, get a comfort level with, the procurement process follows all the rules. It makes sense. It's a level playing field. So you start layering on that comfort level, and you begin to get consensus on, yes, I understand what the process was. That looks like a good process. It looks like you got good bids. Let's move forward. We recommend approval, and it gets approved most of the time. It can get more complex than that. One key example that came up several years ago, as I mentioned, it's a well-run organization. Our on-time performance is very good, 90%, except for the bad weather the last few months.
Great.
But good on-time performance. Things are generally run very well. And so we were recommending, and it took us, several months to work through this recommendation, but we were recommending fundamentally doing the maintenance on our trains differently than we had been previously. And we moved to more of a life cycle maintenance approach to maintaining our rolling stock, our locomotives, and our passenger cars. By using this approach, which over the life of the vehicle is more cost-effective, more reliable, but because we've been so successful in delivering the service, there was a natural reluctance to change something as fundamental as how you're maintaining the vehicles. And so that was an example of the type of issues, type of decisions that will take 4, 5, 6 months to get the board comfortable with that approach, using presentations, individual meetings, separate committee meetings to deal with the specifics, sharing information with them to the point where they said, yeah, this makes sense, we understand it, let's go forward with this. So it just depends on what levels of approvals, what concepts, what action you're asking for to get the board members to feel this is the right approach. And as you're in an area, in an organization like this for a period of time, you understand where each of the board members are largely going to be coming from. What's their area of interest? Is it finance? Is it general reputation of the organization? Are they really into running trains, which fortunately we don't have a lot of those who want to be involved in that. They want to have a well-run service, and they want to have their constituents served by that well-run service, and they want to be good fiduciaries and make sure that all the rules are being followed and money's being spent wisely. And so over time, you understand where certainly individual board members are coming from, but also where their jurisdiction's coming from and from where the commissions are coming from, so that as we're bringing forward or anticipating bringing forward items, we prepare to brief them on it soon enough so they can get their questions out there, provide other expertise if they think that would be helpful, to really understand where they're coming from and be anticipating. And so as we're doing this, I work with my staff, primarily my chief of staff, to kind of bounce ideas off. What are you hearing? Where are the questions going to come from? So we can be prepared to answer those questions in advance and provide the information that they want, and make sure they're comfortable with the approach. And it's worked out very well in getting consensus in a pretty diverse area from opinions in different areas, from Northern Virginia all the way 65 miles south in Spotsylvania County, and getting consensus on what we want to do as an organization.
How much of your time on the average, Doug, would you say you spend on this facet of your CEO role, the interacting with the board and with the commissions and what you might call the external governance dimension? What would you say?
I'd say at least 50%.
Okay.
But it's not directly with the elected officials or with our stakeholders. It's some of that. Some of that is, but other parts of it is as we're preparing projects or preparing issues that come up, or not preparing, but if issues come up, it's being proactive to get on the phone with the board members that I know are going to be interested in this particular issue, to let them know what's going on. This is what we're seeing. This is why this is the case. Certainly, as we're putting together our board packet for the month and looking at agenda items in anticipation, 3 months from now, what are we going to be doing? Okay, that's an issue that these 3 board members have expressed an interest, so let's really approach it from what their questions are going to be, so we can be prepared to answer those. So a lot of that time is spent on anticipating what their interest is going to be, to make sure that as we prepare the information or develop a presentation or close the loop with other stakeholders, we would be able to do that in advance so that they would be feeling comfortable with that.
And I assume most of this you do hands-on yourself, right? In terms
of it's typically a combination of me and my chief of staff, and depending on what it is, if it's operations, then the deputy CEO and chief operating officer will I'll ask him to reach out to board members on the specifics on the operational issues, because he's just more knowledgeable about the specifics of it. If it's a finance issue, if I can't handle it, I'll have my chief financial officer either get with an individual board member, or we'll set up meetings of our committee structure that we form. We have what we call a capital committee that we will bring items forward in a group setting to get into more detail on those. We'll be anticipating, again, I look at things from 3 weeks from now, 3 months from now, 6 years from now, and what are the issues that we have to get prepared for to, again, let our stakeholders, meaning through our operations board and eventually the commissions, comfortable with the direction we're heading on a wide range of whatever we're doing. But
now, things have obviously been going very well. As you look ahead, what are your strategies for improving management of these key relationships with your board and with the commissions? Do you have any targets that you're working on to strengthen this?
A couple of years ago, we began meetings with each commission has an executive director, and so meeting with the executive directors of the commissions. So the three of us meet on a not as frequently as we should basis. A couple of years ago, we were meeting more frequently, but to touch on the issues that are of common interest to them. They actually deal with more things, obviously, than VRE. In the Northern Virginia, they deal with a lot of WMATA issues. In the PRTC south of us, they have a lot of bus issues. And so as it relates to VRE specifically, there's not a lot of overlap, but when we get into budget season, there's a lot of overlap with the commissions, but also with the jurisdictions. So we'll have different meetings with the jurisdictional staff as an oversight group to share the budget preparation with them, to answer their questions, because as we develop our budget, it has to line up with that line item or two line items in the county budget or the city budget that pertain to VRE. So we all have to be on the same page from a financing standpoint, that as we're advancing our budget, in fact, our budget preparation starts 3 weeks after our budget year starts. So it literally takes almost a year to get our next year's budget lined up so it's in sync with the jurisdictions, in sync with the counties, with the state, and so forth. But fortunately, we've got a good organization set up to be able to have those kind of discussions at the jurisdiction level and at the commission level.
Good. Well, Doug, I really appreciate you taking the time to tell us about your highly complex governance structure at VRE. I know how busy you are, so I know it's no small thing to spend this time, and I want to thank
not at all.
you.
I mean, we're glad to share our thoughts on it. Having worked at the other organizations I mentioned earlier, I know much of this is similar to what goes on in other regional authorities, and I think we're all trying to do the same thing: is getting to our stakeholders and being able to answer the questions that they have, so that they can do their part of the job too. So.
Well, thank you for bringing us up to date on your role as
You're very welcome.
Stakeholder Relations Officer. Have a great afternoon.